Good evening and welcome to Slam the Gavel, the show that tells it all regarding family court and CPS issues. I'm your host, Marianne Petrie, and today I've got Michael Sayen back on again, and he and I were talking earlier because I had questions about one of my relatives who had been paying alimony for, I would say, over 20 some years. And what had happened was in the spring, he was found dead in his home, and they don't know how he died. He was in poor health, and he was even in the process of losing his home. And what I did not understand was, and I was asking Michael, how could this happen? Because the ex had remarried and moved on with her life, yet he was still strapped paying this alimony. And I had wondered and even asked another close relative, how did this go on? Why didn't an attorney not step in and say, let's modify this? What happened? And so I'm coming back to Michael here, and I guess I want some answers as to how all this could have happened to my favorite uncle.
Well, you know, to start off with a little bit, as I was looking at a little bit of the history of alimony, and the interesting thing is that alimony and child support both started in 1972 and 1973, respectively. So you have a very interesting thing. Why in the world did two huge evils, right? Alimony and child support, which is really the same thing, right? Let's go ahead and let's give somebody money. Let's transfer money one to the other to take care of the wife, and the other one is to take care of the child. And that happened, as we know, in 1970. That was really the starting of unilateral no-fault divorce, and also the best interest of the child standards started to slowly implement as well. And that actually transpired very, very quickly throughout America. Through every state, they jumped on this, and it was pretty much unanimous. But go on. Hey, Marianne, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about your story and your background with your uncle, and anything that you can kind of remember or remember either about your uncle or about his previous situation, or how you even heard about this alimony.
Well, as crazy as this was, I was shocked to find out that the last time I had talked to him was beginning of April, and he didn't sound good on the phone. He just didn't sound good. And he was looking for me to co-sign on his home, but I'm not in a position to do that. And I felt bad because I was wondering what was going on. But after he had passed, my other uncles explained to me what had been going on as far as him getting this alimony paying out to his ex. But I said, wait, she remarried. Why is he still paying her? Why wasn't this modified? And they really had no answers. They had no idea. I guess they didn't question him and say, hey, buddy, let's help you. Let's fix this or stop this. And I, being with the issues that I've had in the family court system, which I'm sure people are aware of, as I've written the book, Dismantling Family Court Corruption, Why Taking the Kids Was Not Enough. I just had all these even more questions as to why is this corruption continuing? And I'm telling you right now, no man should be paying alimony to anybody.
Yeah, which leads a good question. Should we pay alimony? Should we pay child support? Where did all this come from? Because remember, the same legislators that legislated for alimony legislated for child support. So to get into the mind, we have to understand unilateral no-fault divorce and why that changed the laws all of a sudden and tripled the amount of divorces that we had. I've spoke about this previously in our previous episode, but in 1917, Russia implemented the first unilateral no-fault divorce under Marxism. And Marxism was famous for saying that the only way for the government to increase its power was to destroy the family unit. And then so they thought that by dismantling the family unit, they could do two things. Number one, have the women enter into the workforce. And then number two, that be able to really destroy the patriarchy or the home and be able to have make children wards of the state, or be able to have full control of the entire family, wife, children, and the husband. So as they implemented unilateral no-fault divorce, it actually increased divorce, skyrocketed, actually more than what they were even prepared for. And it was there was 5 divorces for every 1 marriage in 1917. Eventually, they legislated that out, which people don't know, through several acts by implementing taxes and traveling taxes. So eventually, they made it non-advantageous to actually take advantage of unilateral divorce. And I believe the last act to actually implement to try to slow down the unilateral no-fault divorce in Russia was in 1945, because basically after they've opened up, after they uncaged that animal, they had to try to put that animal back in the cage because they realized it was destructing society. But however, in the same thing with England did the same thing. In 1857, the state took authority of divorce away from the Church of England. They implemented allowing women to initiate divorce for the first time due to repeated adulterous affairs of their husband. They put it under the courts of equity, because before it was under canon law under the church. So under courts of equity, they implemented the family division. And it was so bad that by 25 years later, in 1875, they created an act where they actually morphed common law and courts of equity together, because they realized that courts of equity simply did not work. They became way too long to litigate, number one. And number two, they became so expensive because you could fight over morality and ethics forever. So that's kind of a little bit of the history of unilateral no-fault divorce and expanding the woman's ability to divorce. And this really stemmed from coverture laws, which I hope to get a little bit into that.
Okay.
But that's really why the situation of alimony started, because we're dealing with a no-fault system, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if nobody's at fault, then we have to make sure we distribute the funds, right? To make sure that the safety of the children and to make sure that everybody's happy. Because if nobody's at fault, the government's looking at a way to bring equality into a lawsuit where there is no winners, there is no losers, and let's go ahead and just try to make it even. So if that makes sense, Marianne, so the alimony was a way for the courts not to say, hey, who's at fault, right? Who created the divorce? Why did the divorce happen? But it was more a way of saying, we don't care about how the divorce happened or who started it or who did what. We're not looking for a fault-based system. We're just looking to make everything even. And as the divorces started to increase, the government started to be more dependent, or the people started becoming more dependent to single-family homes and those children on the government. And this is where you hear the coined phrase actually from the government, deadbeat dad. That was coined by the government because they didn't know how to control fathers, and especially if the fathers at the early onslaught of this is they moved out of state. Because if you moved out of the state, the other states, just like an example, if you committed a crime in one state, you could leave one state and go to another, and then as long as you went across the state lines, that you were somehow protected under jurisdiction of another state. Well, the same thing happened in early American history when we're dealing with in the 1970s, where we're dealing with child support. The men were leaving from one state and going to another state. Therefore, they would escape the full penalty of the law of child support, and therefore deadbeat dad was created until a federal law eventually came on that expanded the reach of child support and where it actually blurred the state lines. Does that give you a little bit of a history, man?
Yes. And also,
So,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go on. I know I
Well,
wrote you a few questions, and you might have some questions of your own.
right. And you had written a book, and when we had our last podcast, you kind of recommended that people don't read the book because it's mostly for pastors and priests. and rabbis. But it had a lot of things to say about what God had to say about divorce. And I know when I was going through my divorce, I remember my mother saying, well, Jesus hates divorce. And I thought, well, let me call a rabbi and see what he says. And he said, well, no, Jesus didn't say that. Actually, God said um, divorce was okay with God because he gave it to Moses to install because people were killing each other. But Jesus did not say how am I trying to say this? Jesus does not like divorce.
Yep, right. Yeah, I can actually take it on from here. So, so a lot of people, and I speak to a lot of people, and the majority of people actually that I've noticed in the family court reform process, there's many aspects. There's CPS. You're speaking about alimony, which is a hot topic. That's seeming to kind of fade away as the courts are realizing that the women can be a little bit more self-secure, but also the child supports or payments usually are pretty high. Therefore, the main custodial parent really is put in a position, if they're given the full child support, that they really don't have to worry as much as maybe when the divorce started skyrocketing right away. That they know that they can somehow get the security of the child at least. But we have to look at, to be able to understand divorce or marriage and what's right or wrong. Like you said, does God hate divorce? You know, if God hates divorce, why did Paul permit it, right? Except for fornication, right? Or why did Moses permit it? Well, Jesus says in Matthew 19, 1 through 9, the Pharisees and Sadducees were trying to trick Jesus. This is where we hear about the exemption clause. So they're trying to trick Jesus. And by trying to trick Jesus, you'll see in several places in the Gospels where the Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes, they would come, either one or the other group would come and send a delegate that would ask Jesus a question. And it was really to discredit Jesus, right? It was basically to say, hey, Jesus, if you answer this question, right, when one of the Pharisees, I believe, was asked, should we pay taxes unto Caesar, right? Well, that was a trick. Because if Jesus said, yeah, don't pay taxes unto Caesar because of the law of Moses or because this is the Jewish, then what's going to happen is that it would actually create a situation, a legal situation, where Jesus is all of a sudden telling people don't pay taxes. And he would get in trouble with the Romans, or that's what they're hoping. Or if he said, to pay taxes, then he would lose favor with the Jews. So Jesus, being wise, he never answered. If you look at the places where it said they asked Jesus a trick question, he never answered them directly, ever. He always answered them indirectly, and he always answered them in a way that would bring the foolishness of that question, or it would shut the mouths of the Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes, or anybody who tried to trick him and trap him. And it really did the trick. And so, like an example, what somebody might say today, Marianne, somebody might say, who's not a Christian, they would say, hey, can Jesus make a rock so big that he himself can't pick it up, right? And then they would laugh and they would mock you because this question would really be unanswerable. Or if you would answer it one way or another, you would seem like a fool. So what Jesus said when the Pharisees and Sadducees said, hey, is a man permitted to put away his wife? In Matthew 19, that actually stems, we're going to give a little bit of Bible study here, that actually stems from Matthew 5. Now, when we look at Matthew 5, there was a Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus was speaking to the multitude of believers, right, on the Sermon on the Mount. And when Jesus was in Matthew 5:27, Jesus was speaking about adultery. And Jesus said, hey, anyone who looks at a woman inappropriately commits adultery in their heart. Well, when you understand the Greek, you understand that Greek uses something called context. And you can define what's being said by the actual context, but not the actual dotting of the T or dotting of the I's, crossing of the T's, like you would in Hebrew. So the Greek, this is just the Greek language. It uses a lot of context to define what is actually being said. So when Jesus said, he who looks at a woman inappropriately commits adultery in their heart, what Jesus is actually referring to is that any of the married men who look at a woman and inappropriately commit adultery. So it's not referring to singles. Now, what happens is when you look at the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus was addressing the people about those who thought they were righteous, and they thought their righteous acts would get them to heaven. They thought they were sinless. And so what Jesus did on the Sermon on the Mount is he goes through various parts of the Ten Commandments. And adultery, right? Should not sleep with a man should not sleep with another man's wife. That's actually from the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery. So what Jesus does is he does two things. He says, hey, if you're single, right, don't look at a woman inappropriately, otherwise you commit adultery in your heart. For married men. Or a single man looking at a married woman, it would be the same thing. So we understand because they understood the context of adultery was one of them was being unfaithful to a marriage covenant. Goes on to talk about adultery is that he talks about divorce and the misinterpretation of divorce that they had. And Jesus says that they asked Jesus, Jesus goes on and talks to him about the law of Moses. It says that any man who puts away his wife without the knowledge of sexual morality or fornication is porneia, and that was a formal form of the Greek language that didn't really have particularly meaning in there that we could specifically say, but like porneia came from the word porn that we would have today. So when Jesus says if a man doesn't have knowledge of his wife committing porneia or pornography or sexual immorality, that if he put her away, it said that he would cause her to commit adultery. Now, the interesting thing, when Jesus was talking, he didn't blame the woman on this one. He blames the men. He blames the men that, number one, if you put away your woman without the knowledge of sexual morality, referring to Deuteronomy 24 and the law of Moses, or we would say the permission of divorce. If you didn't put away your wife for the strict permission of divorce of uncleanliness, which is sexual immorality, sexual perversion, the unfaithfulness of that marriage covenant, that you cause your wife to commit adultery. And the man who marries a put away woman commits adultery, or any man or whoever marries a put away woman commits adultery. So what Jesus does is he doesn't blame the woman on this. Jesus blames the men. He says, you cause your wife to commit adultery, and if you marry a divorced woman, you commit adultery. Now, the question stems is, why does Jesus in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount, why does Jesus just focus on the men? Why doesn't Jesus say, hey, men, if you divorce, you commit adultery, and women, if you divorce, you commit adultery? Why did Jesus do this in Matthew 5, just focus on the men? Now, the reason why is when you understand the context of marriage according to the Jewish law, and we actually have historical data from Josephus of Antiquity, who was a historian written for the Romans and the Greco-Roman. He was actually hired to write a historical reference of the Jews, a Jewish perspective, and the Roman Empire. Is that he actually wrote there that the Jewish women were not allowed to initiate a divorce according to the law of Moses, because the law of Moses in Deuteronomy 24:1 says, if a man acquires a wife, right, and that she was found to have some uncleanliness in her, or a matter of uncleanliness, this uncleanliness word was actually used earlier, and it was used about a person who made a bowel movement outside their tent and didn't cover it up. It would be this uncleanliness. And we're really familiar with the word clean and unclean. So uncleanliness was a very lucid perspective. However, what it did say in the Hebrew, it said a matter of uncleanliness. And so the Jews were a little confused as far as what is Jesus talking about, because uncleanliness in itself was a very loose term, right? So they didn't know. So when the Jews and the Pharisees and the scribes, by the time Jesus walked on the earth, they actually had a very loose interpretation of, this is from one of their rabbis called Shammai. They had a very loose interpretation of what a man could divorce his wife for. But according to Jewish law, a woman could not initiate a divorce. Therefore, she would not be causing her husband to commit adultery by divorcing him. And that's another reason why the divorced women sought remarriage, because the actual writ of divorce that the man would hand the woman actually says in there at that time that I give you, the man who puts away a wife, he says, I give you permission to remarry. So these women that were put away for various reasons, adultery, uncleanliness, or anything, it actually says on the marriage, on the divorce certificate, the writ of divorce called the get in the Jewish language, they were actually given permission from the very men who divorced them that you are allowed to marry any men. And so these women needed the financial support, which goes back to alimony, because back to alimony in the early 1970s, the government, number one, didn't want women to be dependent on the government to provide for them and the children. They were not going to be able to financially support it. And also they realized is that the man who divorced a wife, or the wife divorced a husband, if he was single, not having kids, well, that means that he had a lot of extra income because he no longer had to provide for a wife and children. So they wanted him to continue with the provision of the wife through alimony and the child through child support. The man was really never designed to have the children. But that's how come they separated the two, alimony and child support, just in case the man did get the child or whoever got the child. So those two things could be separated as far as the allegation or the distribution of funds, to make sure that we're looking at an equality system where the government thought that, hey, we could allow this great tragedy of everybody divorce everybody and for any reason. And this had to do with the feminist women who had a real push, because before 1969 unilateral no-fault divorce, it was under a fault-based systems, and women said they had a hard time proving abuse. Right? If you didn't have a bruise, because abuse a lot of times happen in the home and behind closed doors, right? And so women wanted to be able to escape the fear of men without needing to be able to prove abuse, and especially if that abuse happened emotionally or spiritually or physically in a ways that you couldn't see through outward signs of bruising. So the women just wanted the no-fault divorce system because they had a very hard time approving to the courts in a fault-based system before 1969 that, hey, my husband hit me. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So do you have any questions so far of anything I said? It kind of spilled the beans a lot.
Well, no, that's good. I mean, everyone needs to know the history of how all this evolved. And more is evolving, as I'm finding out that another to spill the beans type of thing is that, people make false accusations, and they'll do it to put the other parent in prison so they can't see their kids. And
Yep.
I find that very horrific as we move along, and I don't know how this whole system can be corrected somehow with people just stop lying.
Yeah, well, what happens is that you have to remember is that any times that a person has an advantage, or can use something to their advantage, that during an emotional divorce, they typically will use that advantage. They'll use that leverage. So when restraining orders came on the scene, that was used, to the leverage. So anytime that you can use a leverage, people will use leverage, because you have a horrific thing. Because Jesus said in Matthew 19:9. Well, first of all, God actually said to the priest in Malachi 2:14-16. God said to the priest, which is very interesting. The priest asked God, why don't you hear our prayers? Right? Because they had all this suffering and carnage that was happening in Israel, and they cried out to the Lord, why don't you hear our prayers? And God said, I don't hear your prayers because you act violently. And the priests were thinking, what in the world is God talking about? So they're like, how did we act violently? And God says that because you put away your wife, your youth, you made a covenant from youth, which had shared a vestige of spirit, which God was a witness to and towards. And he says, you act violently, and your clothes are filled with blood. because you're putting your women away. And what he was talking about was that these priests were really abusing this divorce, and they were marrying different young women and younger women, and they were abusing these women through the divorce practices, the very lucid divorce practices, very easy to get divorce practices of the Jews. And God said that that was an act of violence, and he would not hear their prayers. And you actually hear this again in 1 Peter 3, verse 7, where it tells men, right? It says men, that you need to honor your wife as the weaker vessel. The vessel is actually was the Greek word that we would use as a ship, like a vessel ship. And these women they're usually shorter, and they're usually less muscular on the average. And so men were taking advantage of their physical strength, and they were abusing their wives. And God says in 1 Peter 3, 7, that he wasn't hearing their prayers because if they acted inappropriately toward their wives, and men need to honor them as the weaker vessel. And so God repeats himself, or Jesus repeats actually this, or Paul actually repeats this message, or Timothy, sorry, repeats this message, and Peter, geez, wow, I mean all the apostles, for 1 Peter 3, when he repeats the message that a man is not to act abusively towards his wife, or to use his physical strength against his wife to bring her into submission, because God says he will not honor your prayers. And this was talking to Christians, so this message was for Christians. And we still have the same theme today, is that women are crying abuse, abuse. And men being in power people in power always abuse power. If they're going to fall short one way or the other, being not powerful enough or overpowerful, people in power tend to abuse power. And the less spiritual you are, and the more worldly you are, the more that you're going to do it. Actually, Jesus actually talked about this, or the New Testament talks about this. It says the Gentiles lord over one another. He goes, but don't let this be for you. And it's really this men who are this lording over. And that's what women want. Women want freedom from abuse and submission to abusive men, or just submission in general. Because when you're looking at the opposite of freedom for most women today, if you ask them what would be the opposite of freedom, they would say submission. And I think that's what the theme is. And there's been a lot of Christian women who are writing new books who actually talk about the freedom of submission. But this is always a hard thing if you have an unbelieving husband or an abusive husband. And Paul actually talks about this in 1 Corinthians 7. And he says, hey, if you have an unbelieving husband, right, if he wants to stay in the marriage, stay. And it tells the men, if you have an unbelieving wife, you're married to an unbelieving wife, and she wants to stay in the marriage, stay in the marriage. So Paul's definitely not approving this lucid divorce culture that we're in today, but it's actually the opposite. And the theme of the message was from Jesus is God hates divorce, number one, and then number two, do not separate what God has joined together.
Okay. Yeah, that's I'm glad we've had this history, it's just it just seems like the world is doing its own thing and people are just treating each other vile. And I think this is like the perfect podcast for Halloween. In a way. Because it's so horrific, between the family court, between people getting raked over the coals with child support, and then the alimony and the greed. This is just horrific to me.
Right. And then we always say cash for kids, right? It's really hard to not take advantage of something, because in the same for both the men and the women, if you were empowering the men, right, men were, like in the coverture laws back in the 1600s to the early 1800s, there was coverture laws where men got 100% of the children in a divorce, every divorce. Matter of fact, I think 1862 was the first time in Minnesota, the state I'm in, was the first time that a woman actually got custody of the children. It was in like 1862, and it was the first registered case of a woman getting custody of their children. So when men had the ultimate authority, women were getting abused. And now we flipped it around where women are having the ultimate authority, or it seems to be, and now the men are being abused. And the truth is that Jesus said it very clear. Jesus said from the beginning of time, divorce was not so. And what Jesus was saying was that there was no allowance for divorce until Moses came. Like you said, they were tearing each other up, they were fighting each other, they were killing, they were abusing one another. Jesus actually said that divorce didn't exist until Moses came, but the reason why Moses gave you people divorce was because of the hardness of your hearts. And he was talking to the men, because remember, the Jewish men, and Matthew, first of all, the Gospel of Matthew was written for the Jewish people. Okay, it's a Jewish gospel. It wasn't written to the Gentiles, so it was written to those, and that's why we see a lot of the Old Testament scriptures repeated in the Gospel of Matthew, because it was really people even say that it was actually originally translated from the Hebrew language into Greek. So that's a common thought that's starting to grow now. But with that theme, you could definitely see that when Jesus was talking about divorce, he was talking about it from a Jewish perspective. And he was saying that men were divorced their wives because of the hard hearts. And when we become a Christian, we're no longer allowed to live in the hardness of hearts, nor are we allowed to utilize the law of Moses for our advantage. But what are we supposed to be? We're supposed to be loving and forgiving people, right? You shall know that you are my, people shall know, the unbeliever shall know that you are my disciples by your love for one another, right? And when we look at the Christian family and the Christian home, the intact Christian home, is that there's actually statistically more divorces in the Christian home than there is in an atheist home statistically. Did you know that?
No, I had no idea.
That's right. So when the people look at this world, when they look at Christianity, Christianity has one of the highest divorces of any of the religions and belief systems that are in the world today. Christians is actually one of the highest. So that really tells you a really perspective of that. You know what the world is looking at us, and what they're seeing is they're seeing the destructive nature of the home. And 1 Corinthians 6 says, hey, if you have a problem with a believer, right, bring it before the elders of the church. He goes, for it's a shame for you to bring a matter one against another in the secular world with a secular court system. It says that you blaspheming God, and you bring God to public shame because you sue one another and you fight one another in the public arena. And that's what divorce is, because when you go to divorce, you're slandering one another, even if the two people are Christians. And then later that Sunday, you know, you both are sitting on opposite sides of the church coming that next Sunday, with different families and, you know, different lovers, different boyfriends and girlfriends, and different marriages. And it's just a horrific thing, but it needs to start to be fixed in the church first. And then we can start saturating the world. But that's the only way we're really going to be able to fix this system, is that we must start in the church. God says himself that judgment begins in the household of God first, then to those who are outside. We are being the big hypocrites, as you would say, that, you know, we're the big adulterers as it is today. We're living in adultery, remarrying in adultery, and living in sexual immorality and promiscuity.
So essentially, we've just brought this all on ourselves.
That's right. And that's how come one of the things is divorce and marriage in the church in the early part of American history, as well as English law. However, the court systems took it, and they pretty much took it without a fight from the church. They had the divorce used to be handled. All divorces was going through the Church of England in England, and all marriages were going through the church. Same thing here in America, where we had our churches were doing the marriages. Then what happened when marriage license came out in 1910? The states individually started saying that no, we have taken an inalienable right of marriage away from you, and we're trying to regulate marriage. One, to stop interracial marriage from blacks and whites, and then later on, to, as they claimed, that they continued it because they want to make sure that people didn't transmit sexually transmitted diseases, and you had to get these blood checks before you. But all in all, we're looking at a well-known, established, inalienable right, marriage in itself, a right that existed before the state, and now the state is regulating it. And one of the things is too is that the Christian church is the number one proponent of divorce and this divorce culture that we're in today. And so there's going to be hell and high water to pay really on Judgment Day. And I think a lot of us are going to be really shocked of how a lot of our remarriages that we thought were permissible really were not permissible, and that I think we're going to be shocked at our own sin.
Right. And now it seems like it's not stoppable. You go into court and you think it's going to be fair, and it's not, and then it takes a toll on not only the parent but the child, and the child in other ways, such as parental alienation. And I kind of wonder what God thinks of that.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, because when we look, and I know we're probably running out of time here, but when we look at the law of Moses, only the man was able to initiate a divorce. It said that he was able to put his wife away from uncleanliness. What it claims in Deuteronomy 24:1-4 is that a man would write a writ of divorce and put it into her hand and send her out of his house. Right. So number one, it shows that she would leave with no house. It shows that she would leave with no children. And it shows that she would leave with probably very little. Now, we do read a little bit from Leviticus and other, so a little bit of the historical data that we know a lot of these women were not able to take care of themselves. They might have had, maybe weren't able to hold property, or they weren't able to hold jobs as much, or there was an imbalance as far as going into the workplace, because women probably were not able to enter into that physical workplace like a lot of times we have today. We have a lot of computers, but ever back then at those times, biblical times, there was a lot of working out in the fields. There was a lot of hard slave labor, and women were at a disadvantage physically. So anyways, long story short, women really, when they got divorced, they got kicked out of their house. They got kicked away. They never saw their kids, or they saw their kids only if their husband wanted. And that was the tragedy. And that's why God hated divorce. And that really separated the families. It separated the mother from the children. And then we had a real problem with that. Well, England realized they had a real problem with that in around 1820. And they created something called the younger years, or the tender years doctrine.
Yep.
And what's that?
Oh, I said yes. Yep.
Yeah. So what they did was, one of the, I think her name was Carolyn. She went to the Parliament, if I understand correctly, and then she said, "Hey, we need to, if children are still, sucking on the mother's breast for milk and dependent on the mother for their milk, because we didn't have formula a lot back then, right?
Right.
So they were dependent on it. Well, what would happen if men would divorce these women and they had infants? How in the world, if the men got the children, how in the world were because men, like I said, got 100% of the children after a divorce. They got so under coverture laws, under common law. So the women were like, well, wait a minute, this is inhumane, because these children are going to starve. Like, how do these children go to feed? So Parliament agreed and said that, hey, as long as a child is at the age of 4 and under, it was called the years of breastfeeding, or is that as long as they had those years, that even after divorce, the children 100% went with the mother, and that was for breastfeeding purposes. But they said, but as soon as the child was weaned from the mother's breast, from the mother's milk, then the child would go back to the father 100%. Now, what happened was Parliament, and eventually America as well, is that they started using these tender years or younger years doctrines, and they started to increase the age from 4 to 7 to 9. And then eventually, I think in America, it stopped at around 9 years old. And then in England, I think they changed it all the way to 16 years old. So a child was considered given 100% to the mother until the child was 16 years old. And that was all this all was a twisting perversion of some humanitarian, which was a very good law, was saying that, hey, these children need to be fed. And it's a human rights issue, right? If a child's not able to, to breastfeed and to feed at the mother's breast. There's something unnatural from it. But what happened was the legislators, and they took it and they twisted those laws and they abused those laws so much that women were getting almost 100% of the children for very long periods of time, both in England and in the United States from 1850 until 1950. And that's why the men jumped at the best interest of the child standards, because men were not getting their children, even though coverture laws demanded that the men would get the children. Because of this this doctrine of the younger years, the tender years doctrine. The truth of the matter is that the women were getting the children, and legislation kept on pushing back the years of the children to get older and older, so the men were seeing their kids less and less. And all this really stems from the debate or the controversy between men and women regarding divorce and who gets what. And because men are the protector and the providers, and women are the nurturers and caretakers. And how do you split these roles 50-50? You can't. Do you give the children to the provider and protector, the male of the family, the patriarch of the family, or do you give the child to the caretaker, the nurturer of the children, the mother, right? There is no right answer in a divorce. And that's why legislation keeps on going back and forth throughout many of hundreds of years of English law and American common law.
Well, I am so glad you were on with this lesson in history. I'm fascinated with history and why things have evolved and how things have happened the way they have. And is there any way people can reach you if they have any questions?
Yeah, they can get my book for free on Amazon through Kindle, called The Cure for Divorce, and the subtitle In the Kingdom of God. My name is Michael Sayen, Sayen. Or they can always contact me, email me. I can send them a PDF because it's a self-published, therefore I have the rights to be able to give those for free. Or they can always call me or write me or text me and on Facebook or any other ways if they had if they have any questions or if they want to talk. For the most part, we know the stories are tragic, and I always tell people, hearing divorces is trying to help somebody move. I usually say that if usually you call the guys when you want to have the heavy stuff moved, and I'm usually the same way. When you have a place and you need some major stuff to be taken care of, feel free to give me a call. We can see what we can do. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give legal advice, but a lot of times we like to educate people to be able to make sure that to empower them to be able to understand the laws, to understand their rights, and to understand a little bit of history, and more importantly, understand what God's word has to say and how to live a righteous life in this unrighteous world.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Slam the Gavel is a podcast to help the public understand what really goes on in the family courtrooms that in turn perpetuate parental alienation. I'm your host for Halloween, Marianne Petrie, author of Dismantling Family Court Corruption. Please join us again in the future for another awesome episode. I'm so happy to have you on, Michael Sayen. Come back again.
Thank you.